Welcome back to another episode of Detroit 360, your personal guide to all things Detroit. I'm your host, Sheila Grant. Wow, I just love some of the gyms here in the city, especially the Whitney in Midtown. I love their afternoon teas and their evening garden parties. Some of my favorite things to do. Who doesn't love enjoying a nice cocktail and live music on a breezy summer night? Now, as much as I love the Whitney, it wasn't until recently that I learned more about it. I'm going to enjoy this beautiful day, and I want you guys to stay tuned to this next Detroit Classic piece that explores the history of the Whitney here in Detroit.
My family wasn't into restaurants, and we never had a dream of owning a restaurant or anything like that. But it was the Whitney. It was on Woodward in Detroit on the corner of Woodward and Canfield. And the opportunity to have a downtown office in a historic structure that's been sitting alongside Woodward for 125 years was really appealing to us. So this was kind of suburban Detroit back then, and there were, from Brush Park on out, there was just fabulous homes that lined the streets. And unfortunately, we've lost a lot of those homes. And one of our motivations for coming here was to preserve and protect this one as an example of those homes that were part of Detroit's history.
Good morning. My name is Jim, and I'll be doing the tour today.
My name is Jim Moriarty. I'm also known as the Professor, and I do the tours at the Whitney Mansion. I think that the Whitney's reputation is well known. It provides really good food. Its service is phenomenal.
It's always offered upscale American cuisine. Composed plates, fish, steaks, seafood. Sometimes you have to kind of create a concept, and sometimes you have to realize that you don't need to outthink what's already there. And this was one of those times. It was sort of like let it be what it is, and then delight your customers with great cuisine and consistency and excellent service, but still paying homage to the authenticity of the space and the authenticity of the restaurant and the fact that it has been standing along Woodward for 125 years, and that's what we wanted to celebrate.
This house was built by David Whitney Jr. He was a man who believed in hard work. He believed in direct communication. He was totally honest. When Mr. Whitney was of age, he began working in the lumber industry on the East Coast, where he worked his way up through the company. And then at age 27, he moved to Detroit.
And he ultimately bought a lot of timberlands in Michigan, but also in several states in the Midwest, and mostly white pine.
His business was about buying land, harvesting the trees, and then either selling them as logs or selling lumber. Mr. Whitney realized that for him to grow his company to the size that he wanted it to grow, that he was going to need to be able to deliver product along the entire Great Lakes system. So he started a steam barge system to be able to do this, and when he wasn't delivering his products, he was delivering iron ore mostly, and that came from Lake Superior. Moving forward to 1871, we had the Great Fire in Chicago, and 3.3 square miles burned to the ground. That part of Chicago at the time was mostly wood. So from 1872 to 1880, the city of Chicago rebuilt with wood. At that point in time, Mr. Whitney was the low-cost provider of lumber to rebuild Chicago. He was reasonably wealthy before he moved to Michigan. Then, with the period of time of 8 years to rebuild Chicago, his wealth greatly increased. And by the time he died in 1900, he was the wealthiest man in Detroit and the fourth or fifth wealthiest man in the state of Michigan. I don't think he was flamboyant or ostentatious. On the other hand, he built this house to be the most opulent house in Detroit. At that point in time, this part of Detroit was mostly farmland, Downtown Detroit was the center of business. It was congested, it was crowded. So the people who could afford to live up in this part of Woodward Avenue did so. This was considered to be way out of downtown.
He had all the assets he would need to build a home. First of all, he was wealthy. Second of all, he had the ships to move his own lumber. He had the crews who knew how to shape wood. He used all the finest materials to build this house. And he overbuilt it and over-engineered it in every way. I mean, it's 120 years later and we still find things that are like, wow, I can't believe that he did this. For instance, hardwood floors are often like a 1/4 inch of wood thick, and we have hardwood floors in the house that are like 2.5 inches of wood thick. The concrete in the driveway is usually a couple inches. It was, 14 inches thick here, so he really over-engineered it, and that's because he could, and there's all kinds of great stories about how he built the house. Gordon Lloyd was the primary architect of the house. He designed it in the Romanesque style, which is kind of the heaviness and the pillars and some of the other features that you'll see on the exterior of the house. It also combined Victorian elements representative of the time it was built, and I think it was bigger and grander than most of the houses of the time.
The house was completed in 1894. As built, it was 21,000 square feet, had 52 rooms, 218 windows, 20 fireplaces, and 10 bathrooms. Mr. Whitney spent about $400,000 to build the house. It would be about $10.5 million today. The family moved into the house in 1894, along with a staff of about 20 people.
David Whitney passed in 1900.
This part of Woodward Avenue had changed its character. Detroit had expanded and moved northward up Woodward Avenue, so now it was crowded and congested. The estate allowed Wayne County Medical Society to use this house on a no-charge basis as office space. The Medical Society sold the property to the visiting nurses. The visiting nurses continued to use it until 1979, 1980, and a man named Richard Kuhn bought the property and decided to convert it into a restaurant.
When he bought it, most of the home was covered with drop ceilings and drywall. It had the unintended consequence of protecting all the wood and protecting all the trims. So when Richard Kuhn came in and bought the house, he knew enough of the history to expect that there was detail and kind of ornate woodwork behind all these drop ceilings. And of course, as he started taking down some of those features, he saw all the details. And he did a lot of preservation work. He had to retuck all the stones at a cost of a couple $1 million.
Richard Kuhn continued to own the restaurant until 2007. At that point in time, Mr. Liebler bought the entire property and is the current owner of the Whitney.
There's all types of different wood throughout this house. David Whitney was a lumber baron, so wood was his business and his passion. So we have several floors in here that have 3 or 4 different inlaid woods of different colors to create different designs, and the floors are fabulous. And unfortunately, or fortunately, as a restaurant and as a commercial business, you can't really leave the floors exposed, but we try and maintain them underneath the carpet. The house was built with a number of very specialized architectural features. You'll even see David Whitney's DW initials on the exterior of the house kind of carved into the granite. So he certainly left his mark both figuratively and literally on the house.
I think he wanted to build a house that would be here after him. So here we are 120 years later in Mr. Whitney's house talking about Mr. Whitney.
At that time, people referred to Detroit as the Paris of the West. There's a lot of wealth here. And when we talk about the wealth in the city of Detroit, we often relate that to the auto industry. But the truth is, long before the auto industry came, there was raw materials, carriages. There's a lot of industry here that was making Detroit a very wealthy city going back to the 1850s. So when the Gilded Age came up and people really wanted to express themselves in architecture, art, and all those other kinds of things, Detroit collected a ton of assets.
Both the internal and external walls of the house are made of brick, and the beams in the house are made of iron. When you came into the building, when you saw the outside, you noticed that it's made of stone. And that stone is actually jasper quartzite. It is a naturally occurring material that is extremely hard.
The people would shape the stones when they actually got here on the corner of Woodward and Canfield, and because the stone was so hard, the tools would dull very quickly. And so the workers were having to continually sharpen and get new tools. So he built a blacksmith shop on the premises. I mean, this was a serious production.
So this was the first private home in Detroit to have an elevator, and it was put in the house during the construction of the house. I'm very happy to tell you that today that it's not the original elevator car, so you should be very comfortable using it.
When this house was built, one of David Whitney's contemporaries was Thomas Edison, and he was operating in Detroit. Because electric lighting was so new, David Whitney wanted to have it and try it out in his house, but he also wasn't sure it was going to work. So he hedged his bet by having kind of both lighting systems.
The house was built between 1890 and 1894. So in 1893, it was electrified. There's 4 electrical fixtures in the house that are original, and the rest of the fixtures are replacements as they changed the system in the house.
Expected to see some sort of porcelain.
Pavlovic tile.
There's no Pavlovic tile in the house.
You know, each tour is different, and each tour you try to customize it for the people who are in that particular tour. And my objective is really to enhance their experience, to make it more than just having dinner in this beautiful restaurant.
None of the furniture in the house was original. As you can imagine, going from a home to a set of homes.
Richard Kuhn went to New York City in 1985 timeframe with a man named Ron Fox. And they went to New York to buy period-correct antiques for the house. For example, the large chandeliers that you saw, and when you entered the house, those came from the New York trip. Well, what's interesting about the door, and this is true of all the doors in the house, that if you look at the way it's decorated on this side, and then look at the way it's decorated on this side, you can see that sides are decorated differently. When the door is closed, the decoration on that side matches the rest of the decoration in the room.
The windows, at least many of the primary stained glass windows, were done by Louis Comfort Tiffany, who was one of the Tiffany brothers who later became Tiffany's, you know, and a big deal. At that time, he was just a dude who was really good with stained glass. He did the stained glass in the music room, in Mrs. Whitney's sitting room next to us, and on the staircases. He didn't do his whole repertoire. There's a couple of very unique pieces that we have here. The one in Mrs. Whitney's sitting room is floral, and Tiffany hadn't done many floral pieces of stained glass. And then on our staircase is a swordsman, and he had only ever done 2 swordsmen. One was here and one was at the University of Houston, and those are kind of portfolio pieces of his and very unique and very different from most of his work in stained glass. So, you know, we're proud to have those pieces here. That grand hallway, when you walk in the house, that's the moment that kind of says it all. You sort of walk in and say, wow, okay, this place is for real.
This is the grand ballroom or the grand hall in the house. If we look at the floor, we can see that the floor is made out of English tile. It's a mosaic done in the Flemish pattern. Now you want to remember that at this period of time that each and every one of these tiles had to be laid in cement.
It's an original floor made here in Detroit and pieced together on site.
The floor itself took about 2.5 to 3 years to be made. When you look at the fireplace, the color of the brick is Pompilian, which is a reddish orange. And that's the color you would have found in Pompeii in the large houses prior to Mount Vesuvius erupting. The clock that's in the center, that's an original 24-hour clock, which means it has to be wound every day. The lights on the left and right-hand side, those lights are original, and they were installed by Thomas Edison himself. On this floor, all of these large rooms have these large pocket doors, and what they were for was so in the wintertime, when they were trying to heat the house, these doors would be closed to isolate the big windows, and so hopefully they could better heat the core of the house. The house itself had a state-of-the-art heating system.
We don't use a steam heat anymore. I mean, now we have a very complex heating and cooling system because you can't run invasive ductwork through walls like this. You know, it'd be nice to think that you could have central heating, central air conditioning, and flip one switch and have it go, but that's not how we do it, nor how many historic buildings like this do it.
If we were coming to the Whitney's house and we were going to have dinner, the butler would bring us into this room, which was the receiving room. In the receiving room, Mr. and Mrs. Whitney received each and every individual, each and every couple. The fireplace surround is white onyx, and if we were able to pull up the carpet that we have here today, you would find a floor that was made of bird's eye maple and mahogany. The mahogany comes from Honduras. He was sourcing material around the world as he was building this house. If you look at the room, the style of this room is the Empire style. You can see that on the ceiling and on the walls that we have the detail painted out in a monochromatic white. When the Whitneys were here, it was done with an ivory color with gold relief. The drawing room is where the rest of the guests would be for the evening, and you would mix with them, you have cocktails, and wait until the butler announced that dinner was ready. So the butler has announced that dinner is ready, and so we've moved to the formal dining room. In the formal dining room, the first thing to look at is the beautiful chandelier. That chandelier is an original Tiffany chandelier. And then when you look at the ceiling, we can see the beautiful mahogany ceiling, and all these circles that are in the ceiling are just absolutely perfect. The scenes that you see inside the geometric shape, those scenes are hand-painted on canvas. The rest of the wainscoting in this room is also mahogany, as is the built-in sideboard. The tapestries that you see on the far end of the room, those tapestries are original. The third tapestry on the left, it's actually mounted on a door. And behind the door is a steel safe, and it's there both as a safe room for his family as well as for his valuables.
In 1890s, it was before banks were insured federally. And so a lot of very wealthy people would have some of their wealth stored in their home. When you see these older homes that have a large walk-in safe, it's usually in the center of the house, and the architectural support beams of the house actually lay across and beside it. So theoretically, if you were to try and blast the safe out of the house would have collapsed inward onto you, and you couldn't separate it out because it's part of the actual structure.
Here we have the fireplace in the dining room, the marble surround. It's called nobilium, and it's from Africa. And you can see all the great detail that is on the mantle here. So here we are in the library. We have the fireplace, and you can see that it has a beautiful blue surround. The tile is Delft tile. It comes from Holland. It's heated to about 1900 degrees to give it the sheen on the surface and also the deep blue colors that you can see.
In those days, a lot of socializing and recreation would be gathered around the piano, so a lot of that occurred in the music room.
And if you look in the music room where the large buffet is, that was originally a custom grand piano because Mr. Whitney wanted the wood in the grand piano to work with the wood in the music room. Above the grand piano, you'll find 4 stained glass windows. Those are Tiffany windows. The one on the left is St. Cecilia playing a pipe organ. The third one over is Apollo playing his lyre, and then we have the second and the fourth windows, which are cherubs coming down into the room from the ceiling. On the ceiling, it's hand-painted and it's painted on silk.
If you were going to paint on silk, you'd always back it with paper. And in those days, the highest quality paper was always used for music scrolls. And so if you peel that down and you look at the paper behind it, you'll find that it's actually old music scrolls, because that's the thickest, best paper that you could get in those days.
The long carving that you see across the two poles, that's done out of maple, and it was done out of one piece of wood. You can see how intricate it is, and it's amazing to think that all of this was done by hand. There were no computer-aided drawings, and it's a beautiful piece of work. Now we're going to look at the knight and the centerpiece in that beautiful Tiffany window. And the knight is there to protect the lineage of the Whitney family. His beard and his face and his left hand is very detailed, and that's because that is actually painted glass, not stained glass. Louis Comfort Tiffany, he started out as a painter. So for him, that would not have been a difficult transition in terms of painting on the glass. So this is the second floor of the house. As was reasonably typical for houses of this period, the ballroom was on the second floor. And this is the main bedroom floor for the family. Mr. Whitney used this house for business purposes. He did a lot of business entertaining, and when they had a large event, they used the ballroom. By this time, 1895, 1896, Mr. Whitney had the largest lumber company in the United States. He was doing a great deal of shipping on the Great Lakes. He owned more land in Detroit than the next 4 people combined. The room to the right is Mr. Whitney's bedroom. As was reasonably typical in that period of time, Mr. and Mrs. Whitney slept in separate bedrooms. This is Mr. Whitney's bedroom. And most people, when they see the size of the bedroom and how plain it is, are rather surprised. You'll notice that the windows are relatively plain, the cornice work is simple, and the fireplace is relatively small. But Mr. Whitney was quoted as having said that, in fact, he could live in a log cabin. And so this room represents, I think, Mr. Whitney as the person. The ornateness of the house was Mr. Whitney as the businessman. Mrs. Whitney, on the other hand, apparently never said that she would like to live in a log cabin. So let's go down and look at her bedrooms. So this is Mrs. Whitney's bedroom, and I think we can see it's quite a bit larger and nicer. The windows are beautiful bay windows. They look out onto Woodward Avenue. The cornice work is very nice, it's very clean, and I think her fireplace is large enough now to be elegant. On the left side of the fireplace, behind where the white flowers are, is a door, and that door went out to a balcony. I would imagine that she'd be out in the balcony in the morning having her tea and crumpets. Now, let's go into her sitting room. In some ways, it was the counter to his office. She could come in here, she could relax, she could, if she sewed or knit, she could do that, she could read. So a sitting room was a place for the woman of the house to get away. You can see here to the left, we have French doors that go out into that same small balcony that we talked about in her bedroom. Above the French doors is a Tiffany stained glass window. And notice in the lower right-hand corner of that window that there's these nice red flowers. You don't see red in stained glass too often outside of a church, because to make the color red, you mix the glass with gold. The fireplace that we have here, the mantle and the surround, is all original. This marble comes from Africa. The ceiling is very nice and very decorative. The cornice work is bold and elegant. And the chandelier that you see hanging there, that is a reproduction. Next, we want to talk about the Tiffany stained glass windows that we see here on the landing. Those windows are original. They would have been made in New York City at his gallery and then shipped out here to Detroit. In these windows, you depict bringing nature and music up through the house. You can see that there are large vines on the lower windows, and the vines come up and they go through the rosette. And then down on the lower part of the window, you can see shapes that look like musical clefs. And then these 3 windows come up to the top window, where you see in the center a heart surrounded by a vine and then supported by musical clefs. This railing starts on the first floor and goes up here to the art gallery. And what you see in the railing is you see this shape of a musical clef. You have the shape of a bass clef here, a rosette down here, and a branch of a vine here. We have the railing bringing the music and nature up through the house, up to the art gallery, and being able to combine all the passions of their life. The large room on this level, which we call the Ghost Bar, was originally his art gallery. So the bar, of course, was not here until about 1985. And Richard Kuhn was traveling in Italy, and he saw the top of the bar that has the bust. That piece is from Tuscany. It's circa 1880, so it's period correct for the house. And the bust on the top is that of Caesar Augustus. The lower part of the bar was made by a man in Ypsilanti. Now we have a bar that has Michigan on the bottom, and we have Italy on the top. If you look at the ceiling, you will see that there is white glass. Originally, that glass was clear, and behind the glass was indirect lighting for the gallery. And we have these two sets of boxes that are leather material. The lower box, you can see, is a face, and it's a face of the muse. In fact, there are 4 different faces there. There's 3 men. There's one that is of a woman, which is a little bit strange because usually muses are women and not men.
This room that we're in was a guest bedroom. The room on the other side was also a guest bedroom.
And then the small room was the absinthe room where they drank the adult beverage of the day.
What we encourage people to do here at the Whitney is arrive early, go up to our Ghost Bar, have a cocktail, be in that space, mingle with your friends. Then you can go down to the first floor, enjoy your meal, have great service, great food. And when your meal's done, you can come up to the dessert parlor, have dessert coffee or cordial at the end of the night. And now you've still had a meal with your group, but you've been in kind of 3 different spots, and you've changed your energy and location, and you've gotten to move around and sit next to different people, and you've gotten fresh linens and tablecloths and glasses and everything else. We made a commitment to this building in part because we wanted to preserve a piece of Detroit's legacy and protect it. But it's so rewarding and so nice to see now how much is being saved and how much is being renovated. And most of the development activity, both in Midtown Detroit and New Center, most of it is historic renovation right now. I think it's great that we're starting with historic preservation and saving the assets that we already had, because Detroit was a fabulous city, is a fabulous city, and will be an even better city in the future, I hope. And so it's just really exciting for us to be part of that.
If you like these stories and want to see more, subscribe to our YouTube channel at City of Detroit and follow us on social media at City of Detroit and at Stories from DET. Well, that's it for this week's episode of Detroit 360. I'm your host, Sheila Grant. Thanks so much for watching.